Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Deli. I'm Maron Rand, along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette, Leslie Chesterman, and our very special guest today, Clifford Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln, thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry, you said don't call you
Don't
Mr.
call
Lincoln.
him.
Okay, my bad. For those who don't know, Clifford Lincoln, who has been involved in Quebec politics, federal politics, political analyst, consultant, and you're 195 years old, I believe. Is that correct?
Something like that.
Around that. So you're here today on a rather auspicious day for two reasons. Number one, you wrote a column in the Gazette a couple of weeks ago, which gained a lot of notice. And you're here on the day, as it turns out, sadly, when we know that Brian Mulroney has passed away. And I'm sure that over the years you've had interactions with him. So I thought we'd start by having you look back on Brian Mulroney's life, if you would.
Yeah, what I retained from Brian Mulroney, although I was on the liberal side, I found him a real approachable person, genuine. When my first wife died in a car accident in Rome, he was one of the first people that called me. And it was spontaneous, it wasn't political. And even though we didn't share the same parties, I found him a very friendly person, very approachable, very decent, a real Quebecer. He showed us that you could come out of Quebec in a small town and being fluently bilingual, having a connection with the people of Quebec, being a real Quebecer, at the same time being a strong federalist and being respected by all. And I think it was quite a feat, that suddenly broke the long hold of the Liberal Party in Ottawa and created many things. I was very involved in the environment as Minister of the Environment in Quebec, and also when I went to Ottawa, some of the leading environmental legislation at the federal side happened Mulroney's watch. We wanted to clean up the St. Lawrence, for instance, and I'd been asking the federal government to give us a grant to clean up the St. Lawrence, and it was due to Brian Mulroney that we didn't get it. We got $110 million for 5 years, and it still gets carried on till today. Every 5 years repeated. Started with him, and I remember when we launched the program, he came to Montreal. We had a launch at the port in Montreal, and it was due to him that it happened. He also gave us $10 million to start the Marine Park of the Saguenay, which was a first in Quebec. So I have a lot of respect for him, a lot of gratitude. I find him a decent person, a true Quebecer and Canadian.
And a great federal, in terms of international,
statesman.
A great statesman in terms of, you might have had ideological differences with him on party lines, a lot of people have, but I mean, no denying that he was respected worldwide, and sometimes we don't see that coming out with our current leaders often.
Absolutely. And he had developed a special relationship with Reagan in the United States. He was respected right throughout the world, and I think a lot of it had to do with his personality. He was a likable person. He was fun. He was a proud Canadian, and so it's sad to see great people like him.
And his stance against apartheid with Nelson Mandela, a lot of
absolutely,
which was
took a big lead.
Yes, exactly, big lead.
Yet people will look back and bring up, and this is interesting in watching, of course, now so many years later, Meech Lake, the Charlottetown Accord, both efforts that ultimately failed, and wonder how much of that brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, exactly. I often think I was in Quebec at the time of the Meech Lake, And I voted for Meech Lake. And then I took part in the federal leadership for a little while, liberal federal leadership. It was a bit quixotic, it failed. But at the same time, Meech Lake was a big issue. And everywhere I went, you would go to Halifax, you'd go to Vancouver, are you for or against Meech Lake? And Krejcir, who won, was totally against Meech Lake. And today, when we look back, if we had passed Meech Lake, how much trouble we would have avoided. The 5 conditions Quebec put forward were extremely reasonable by today's standards. It's a real pity it never happened.
So, with respect to politics, it's been a busy week politically. Just a day ago, we had the Quebec Appeals Court rule on Bill 21. I want to get back to what you wrote about, but I want to start with that. First of all, your reaction to that ruling and where you think it goes from here.
We all respect the court judgment, so...
Well, not necessarily if you're Francois Legault. Because, a week ago, he told the appeals court here he didn't respect their decision.
No, I realize.
Suggested they're all federally appointed, and therefore he would have to challenge that decision. So
this is why one more reason why we should say the courts have ruled, and we've got, as citizens, we've got to accept it. At the same time, I personally hope it goes to the Supreme Court. I see that the federal justice minister has made some soundings that he might take a stand. I hope so. It's about time they did. I found personally this judgment very sad for all of us because it almost gives license to a government now to use the notwithstanding clause just whichever way they want. And so if that is the case, what happens to our charters? So they are saying the notwithstanding clause of the charters it sort of don't interfere with each other. So what's the point of a charter? And so I read a lot about the notwithstanding clause, the background of it, at the time of the constitutional debate to bring the Constitution back to Canada. And there was a tremendous amount of discussion and debate on it. And I recall reading one of the great constitutional lawyers in Canada, Maurice Manning from Toronto. He was a prophet, and he said, the minute you accept the notwithstanding clause, you negate all the fundamental freedoms. And he said, if you do it, what freedom have we got? And the counter-argument was to say, oh, well, it's just purely a clause to use in exceptional circumstances. Both Prime Minister Trudeau and Justice Minister Krejcir, who were against the notwithstanding clause, but they wanted the Constitution back in Canada, so they made a compromise, and they said, oh, it'll never be used. And they kept saying, oh, nobody will use it. It's just a bit of a stopgap, a sort of in case of special circumstances. Well, it happens now that this government is using it freely every day of the week, and it's a crying shame because then if the courts allow the clause to be used willy-nilly, what freedoms have we got? In other words, if it suspends the Charter of Rights and Freedoms so freely, so any government with a majority, and when you think of the CAQ, it got elected with 37% of the votes. So in other words, a great majority voted against it. But with our system of first past the post, you get a large number of seats, you got complete freedom to do whatever you want. The opposition is very small in seats. So every day of the week they can just, with impunity,
Do what they want.
suspend the charter. I mean, I find that really sad, and I hope the federal government eventually soon makes
They
stand.
say they will if it goes to the Supreme Court, but so far they've been noticeably silent.
Yes.
Which I find kind of strange. You
I
would
find
think-
it very strange. They've been complicit on Bill 96. They even voted with the Bloc Québécois to approve Bill 96 twice. It's unbelievable, including the cabinet, including the justice minister, including Prime Minister Trudeau. And then they passed C-13, which incorporates 96. So when you add all this together, I think it's a very sad day for fundamental freedoms and minority rights.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the hub of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowden Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowden Delicatessen. So you were in a provincial government when Robert Bourassa was the premier, and we got to the point where you decided one day, I can't support this idea. So back then, I guess Bill 178?
178.
Before Bill 101, and you were a man of conviction, said, no, I can't. Did you ever think we would end up now, some 40 years later, in basically the same position yet again by having these restrictive laws against other communities other than French be so prevalent?
Oh, I didn't think then it would go that far, because I thought when it happened, 178, I thought to myself, boy, we've really reached a pinnacle now. But 178 seems extremely mild compared to what's happened since. In other words, I find Legault just, with Bourassa, I got to know him really well because I was in the cabinet. I could see him every day, and he was a decent person. I left without any rancor or anything against him. Stayed in good terms with him because he was a decent person, and he genuinely felt that if he didn't use the notwithstanding clause, there would be a social unrest in Quebec about language. So I don't share that view, of course, but at the same time, that's what he felt. But with these people, the CAQ, I think they're snide. They really mean to do it very consciously, applying it to one piece of legislation after another, really deliberately. So I think it's a scary time for us.
But is decency a relic of the past in politics today? Because we don't see a lot of decency in politics, even in Canada, on many levels. You were in politics at a time where you respected each other. There was a certain level of respect. But especially if we look at what's going on in the States or even Europe or even here today, do you feel that that's gone?
Oh, you're quite right. That what we're seeing today, it's almost a worldwide phenomenon. The polarization, the division, the conflictual systems, to the point where nobody respects the other. I mean, I started in politics in Quebec deliberately because this is where the action was about the referendum. It was just after the referendum that I got elected, and we all volunteered to go in. Herbie Marks had a big job at the university, Daniel Johnson. We all did it because we felt we were federalists. And we wanted to save the idea of Canada and so forth. And I served with René Lévesque was there, and Landry and all the other. They were very smart people. We didn't like each other very much ideologically. But outside, Landry, I would call him Bernard, you would call me Cliff, and this kind of stuff. There was
respect.
There was animosity politically. But personally, there was a bit of a kid. You respected each other, and one time I remember there was Minister of Communications Bertrand, And I said something really snide about him. I said, you know, he was a cocky little guy, and I said, you're like Goebbels. And then the speaker, you know, told me this is not acceptable. So I went to see him, and I said, I'm terribly sorry. I wrote him a little note, and we ended up as friends, you know. You get emotional in politics, and you say things you regret, and then you know, you make up. I mean, like Paris and all these people. But today, I find that these people are the CAQ. They're not open-minded. They're snide. They develop legislation that just comes in suddenly, deliberately, you know, inimical, and what happened to the universities, for instance. So
Yes.
Let's
crazy.
talk
let's
about
talk
that.
about
The
That's-
next
You
topic.
wrote a very searing
that's what-
op-ed in
yeah.
the Gazette about that, and with a particular reference to Monsieur Legault's office across from McGill.
It's really so sad. If tomorrow any country, whether it was Switzerland, whether it was France or Germany or United States, had a university like McGill, they would be so proud. They would say, you know, as the Americans always tout Harvard and Yale and the Brits, Oxford and Cambridge, and here we've got an Oxford and Cambridge. And what do we do instead of being so proud to have it in our soil? We try to destroy it. I mean, how stupid can you be? And then, and it's all to do with this lack of confidence in themselves, that they feel that if tomorrow you learn English, you're going to lose your French. That's crazy. My mother couldn't have been more French than she was. You know, so the first language I ever spoke with her was French. I read French at school. I wrote it. I still do. And I went to an English middle school and upper school and university in English, and I never lost my French. I can still write it. I can still speak it. I've traveled a lot in my life, as all of you have. You know, I've been to Switzerland, where they speak 4 languages. Nobody's prouder than the Swiss of Switzerland. But they're open-minded, so they create this huge little country like this, solid banks, you know, industrial giants like Nestle, Brown Boveri, and they speak 4 languages officially, but also English. I've done a lot of work with the Scandinavians politically for 10 years. You know, I've been to Finland and Switzerland, Sweden and Denmark and those places, countries that can be comparable in size to Quebec. They're all so proud of their origins, and at the same time, they all speak English. They learn English at school, but you know, they haven't forgotten Finnish or Swedish or Danish. It's so sad, this complex that we have here, that if you learn one language, you're going to kill the other. Instead of saying, we build a solid base here, we are much more powerful and influential within the federal system if we know both languages. As we have shown, we've produced more prime ministers than any other place. We've produced more foreign affairs ministers and top ministers in Canada. Instead of saying, we got the best of both worlds. Instead of that, you create a little cocoon, you build walls on yourselves. You say, oh, well, don't learn English because you're going to kind of lose your French. Well, instead of saying, the other day I was speaking to a top educational professional who was telling me that he deplores the quality that he sees in young French-speaking people here. They don't write well, they don't speak well. And he said, instead of spending all their time in building up the quality of French and at the same time opening the place to the reality that you live in a continent where over 90% of people speak English, and that it's a lingua franca, instead of making us a base for having the best of English and the best of French so that you can get all these home offices here. Oh, no, you say, no. If you're an American and you come here, make sure your kids don't go to English school. You know?
Yeah.
And so what do? They go to Toronto.
Right. Yeah, there's actually this week in the French press, there's been a lot of talk about this backlash within public schools of kids from immigrant backgrounds who are pushing back and saying the kebs. Have you read about this?
Anymore, yeah.
That's it, and they're pushing back on a lot of this French Canadian culture and so by isolating themselves, what maybe is also happening is that they're, like you said, the cocoon is that they're
It's a
pushing
paradox,
away.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are. It's a paradox. You're right.
It's a paradox.
I would just ask, though, because if we go back to this idea, and you've heard the Premier say this over and over again, take the tuition hikes as an example. It's to protect and promote the French language, and he always says French is in peril in Quebec, in Montreal. Do you accept that?
Of course, I don't accept it. You know, I came to Montreal from British Columbia in 1964, and I look back 64, 70, and 2024. And the difference is unbelievable. I mean, I go I live in the West Island. I go to the Bay. There's not a word of English anywhere. I go to Best Buy, and technologically, I find it easier to understand English and French. Although I can, but technologically, the English terms are easier to me. So I go to Best Buy. You can't even see anything in English, and so I find the West Islanders, English-speaking ones, they've adapted, they have compromised, they've accepted it, and nobody's against the French. I live in Baie-D'Euf, next door to Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue. I go there, English and French coalesce together. I've never had any fight or quarrel with any French-speaking person over language. It's all political. The minute you introduce politics into it, they use it as a wedge to instill fear into the people. It's a brainwashing that eventually makes people fearful of losing their culture and language. I served in the National Assembly with a young guy who was just newly elected at Le Bourassa, called Maurice Richard, the name of the hockey player. He had been the mayor of Nicolette, the nicest person you could meet. And during the debate on 178, we had the caucus debate. It was very emotional, and so I spoke about an open society and against notwithstanding clause. And he came to see me and he said, "You know, Cliff, I listen to you and I understand what you say and it makes sense." But he said, from my point of view, he said, I was raised as a little kid. Today he was 37 or something. He said, from the time I was at school, I heard that I was going to lose my language and culture. And it's very deep within me, this fear. And he said, it's hard to shake it loose. And I've always remembered this.
One of the big contentions of the CAC is not so much French on the West Island, but they're saying they are hearing too much English in downtown Montreal. And you made a very interesting point about that as to why someone has their office so close to McGill downtown.
Yeah, Well, I'm just saying it jokingly that the premier, said there's too much English around me, and it would be simpler to move his office back to Hydro, Quebec, where he won't see the Rodney Gates, and he won't have this malaise, saying too much English. So, what is wrong with McGill being an English language institution? That's what its vocation is. So if there's English on McGill, I mean, it's not very surprising. You got to be really small-minded and silly. And Legault, I don't know him, but I'm sure he's an intelligent person. He's a fellow who should be very proud. He created Transat, and must be a smart businessman. And I'm sure deep down, he must kind of realize, something is happening in Montreal. The other day I read in one issue of the paper, investment has gone down by 24%. At the same time, the Conseil du Patronat was saying, leave this tuition stuff alone, and we are confining ourselves on far too much. The same paper had some other story about Quebec losing whatever it was, and we keep sort of restricting ourselves by shutting ourselves in a little environment now where the big argument is, well, we are a small group in a sea of English in North America, which is true. At the same time, I could point out to them the Finns, 5 million of them, have been occupied by Russia. They live next door to Russia, 140 million Russians. The Baltic states are tiny little countries occupied by the Soviets for a long time. There are no less Lithuanians and Estonians and proud of the language, which they have managed to keep under the Soviet occupation. You take, if the Quebec argument is correct, what about the Vietnamese versus China? The Vietnamese are next door to a massive China with 1 billion. They keep speaking Vietnamese. They've kept their culture. So all this stuff, I find it very sad myself to.
Well, it's very reactionary politics, but like the latest polls seem to suggest that the PQ is surging at the expense of the CAQ, and there could be a change there. We've spoken to M. Plamondon here in the podcast, M. Nadeau-Dubois. I got to say, in many respects, I feel a little more comfortable talking to them. They don't have the same hostility, it seems, which I find bizarre, towards, like, Anglos are more welcoming on a lot of levels. So I find that curious, considering the CAQ is supposedly a Federalist Party and the others are not. So what is your take on that?
Well, I share your view. At least they are frank, open. They tell you exactly where they're going. And I think they're genuine by saying, I want Quebec to be an independent state, which is fair enough. You've got your point of view and you agree or disagree, but at least we know where they stand. With the CAQ, they pretend to be Federalist, but they obviously are not. They're the snide independentists. Their policies are always hidden and subversive. I find the PQ far more open-minded in the sense that they tell us exactly where they're going. And so now I'm hoping myself that there'll be a resurgence of the Quebec Liberal Party, which is going to give us a choice. A lot of people are dejected about the Quebec Liberal Party, but I've taken interest in what's happening with them because of the future of Quebec. And I find they're quietly planning very well without fanfare. There's a few very interesting potential candidates that are quietly watching it. I think what they are doing is clever, to leave it until later for the leadership to take place next spring. It'll create a buzz, and I think we are going to end up with two very clear choices. There'll be the Pequists, and there'll be the Liberal option, which will be, of course, the Liberal Party will always have to be nationalist in a sense, because but I think there'll be two clear options with good leaderships, and people will choose. And
So you think the CAC will collapse?
I think that the CAC is going to be in real trouble. First of all, they're building now. They were left by Carlos Letao, the Finance Minister, and Couillard, who was a brilliant person. He was the first to balance a budget after 50 years. He left a surplus of $7.5 billion. Admittedly, we've got to admit that COVID, came in. At the same time, they wasted it completely. At one point, you remember Legault was giving $400 checks to every Quebecer.
Yes, yes.
Just purely a political move. That's throwing money out of the window, and all sorts of expenses that were not justified. Right now they are in deficit. They're talking about $4 billion, but to some people that I spoke to the other day that know the inside story of Quebec tell me it's going to be much more. And so financially they're in trouble. Healthcare is in a mess of the first order. Give you an example. One person that follows healthcare very closely was telling me they had planned the Vaudreuil Hospital. It was approved under the Liberals. The land has been bought. They were supposed to have constructed it already. Nothing has been started. Meanwhile, because it's not been done, the Lakeshore Hospital is exploding. It can't cope with the number of people, so it's in a mess.
Yes.
And so the short of nurses. Meanwhile, they canceled the training center of Dawson.
Dawson, yes.
Which had been approved.
Yes.
So instead of having nurses now, you find that the Glen has to cancel a whole ward for lack of nurses, and so they're in trouble in healthcare.
Environment, what grade would you give them on the environment? Former environment minister, what do you think of that?
The environment now has been so downgraded by them that they have an environment ministry now. What's happened with Northvolt? It's a real scandal, really. What they did is fiddle the rules so that there wouldn't be any assessment and evaluation of the project. I mean, I'm not against investment. At the same time, you can't just fiddle the rules so that it suits one particular investment. What about the other? You got to have rules that bind all of us, and so the environment is very downgraded. It doesn't have any stature or clout in Quebec anymore. So I think the CAQ is really going down, and they've got 2 years to go. and you could see that the trends now towards how the Pekists have.
Yeah. I would ask you, we have to wrap up, as you sort of lay out this future, let's, if we can fast forward to 2026, let's say the CAQ become a spent force, and then we're back to, again, another vote in Quebec on sovereignty. You have the PQ who are gaining. Let's say the Liberals gain some strength. Is that where we're back to 30, 40 years later? A fight over sovereignty?
I sure hope not, because mind you, Plamondon has vowed that he will call a referendum, and I tend to believe him that he will do it. And if he does, if he gains a victory and becomes the premier, then it will happen. The only chance for us to avoid it is for the Liberals to take over and become a strong party and beat. And I think there's, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that we've got a few really interesting people interested in the leadership of the Liberals now.
Is Denis Coderre one of them?
Yes, I was getting.
Denis Coderre is one of them, but I don't think he'll. Yeah, well, anyway, he will be there. But I think there'll be other choices, and somehow whoever wins it will be. I think the Liberals are going to be coming out of the doldrums.
Can we survive, last question, can we survive another referendum?
I think it would be a disaster, really, because the publicity that it generates outside of Quebec is so terrible, really. I mean, it's when I was at the federal, I was a federal MP, I was put in charge of getting the biodiversity secretariat of the United Nations for Montreal. So I presided the federal, provincial, and Montreal group that went to Jakarta to fight for, and we were sort of outsiders. The favorites were Geneva, and Europe was backing Geneva very strongly, and Switzerland is well seen internationally. So we were outsiders, but we managed to get a lot of votes from Africa and South America. We had a good plan, a good campaign, and we got to Jakarta. And Switzerland's big argument was, don't trust Quebec. It was a year Paris was going to go for a referendum. And they said, look at what's happened. Quebec is going to be an independent state. And they really
This is coming from Switzerland.
Coming from Switzerland, and they were saying it loud and clear.
Right.
They were not beating around the bush. Every time we would go to a delegation, they would say, hey, what do you say about this? And thank goodness, we still managed to get the vote of the Africans and the South Americans, and we have the biodiversity office here in Montreal. And but it did come up very clearly, because obviously it's got a huge impact in the world. What Legault and Plamondon don't realize is that the news don't stop here, not anymore. In an instant communication, it's like wildfire.
Anyway.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time today. Clifford. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure.
That'll wrap up our Corner Booth podcast this week. We'll see you again soon.